Okay, so Bob, I have another email here. Patron Belina from Gainesville. Patron Belina. I think I accidentally emailed her back and called her Belinda because because you see Belina and it just looks like Belinda. And she was, I think she pointed out, no, it's Belina. Everyone thinks it's Belinda. So I want to say, Patron Belina from Gainesville writes, how often have you come across people in your personal lives who are either put off or intimidated to learn that you're a therapist? Does this come up? This has come up a lot. Is it a barrier for new relationships? How do you keep from therapizing your spouse and friends? How do you avoid overanalyzing everything? How does it affect the way that you handle conflicts? Bob, what do you think?
I love this question, Belina. Well, it's actually several questions, and I got a lot of thoughts brewing in my head. But the first thing I'm thinking about is I met my wife on Match.com, and part of our email interaction before we met face to face was, what do you do for a living, et cetera. And I think in my profile it said I was a therapist, and she found that really intimidating. Like, I'm going to sit with her and analyze her and, find out what's wrong with her, et cetera, et cetera. And that felt scary to her. So she says to me in an email before we meet, so what made you become a therapist? And I gave my standard response, which is fucked up childhood. And she said it immediately put her at ease. And she thought, oh, okay, regular guy. I can go meet him and it'll be all right, which of course, So most of my friends are therapists. Well, most. I don't know if most. Many of my friends are therapists. Many of my friends don't even know me from in that part of my life. And so they just relate to me like I'm Bob and don't really, I don't imagine, though I never asked. I don't imagine anybody on my bowling team that actually even really thinks much about what I do for a living or finds it, relevant to bowling and having a beer and enjoying one another every Monday night. The other question was, how do you avoid therapizing? I love this part too because I don't. And I can be seduced by that, by thinking that because I have some training and some knowledge that my analysis of people, maybe even Colleen, it must be accurate. And one of the things that I'm constantly coming back to in my own therapy is my therapist will say to me, oh, yeah, therapists, they can get kind of like pseudo-psychologically minded and think that their opinions about people are, relevant or accurate, and it all is a stand-in for avoidance. And, time and again, I have found myself thinking that my assessments are important and they turn out to be an avoidance of me. And this has not happened to me in probably about 12 days. The last time that happened to me, where I was like, here I am again, thinking I know something, and then I kind of wake up and I'm like, and I said this to Colleen, I'm like, I did it again. I'm thinking this, and it turns out that. And she said to me, yeah, I know. Very funny.
Well,
so
do you want to share? Do you want to share what it was?
Oh, let me see. We were having a fight. And my assessment was that I'm the one that's willing to be vulnerable, and Colleen's not willing to be vulnerable, or something like that. And I
so
was
you
really
had, you had a clinical idea of, they're like, well, because of her traumas, and I've done all this work, and she's like, what was the inner dialogue with that?
Yeah, no, it's pretty much what you just said. And I go to my own session and we're talking about it, and yet again, and he's really decent about it. He doesn't like just try to, nail me with it, sit down, here's what's going on. He's like, oh, you did it again. This is like a 30-minute conversation. Mostly she's just validating me and validating me. And I'm like, God damn, I'm doing it again, aren't I? And he's like, yeah, you're doing it again. And we talked about that. And it turns out I'm just scared. And I'm scared most of the time. So, like my weirdo attachment style will mask itself in these kind of pseudo assessments, right? And, on the one hand, I'm kind of embarrassed by that, and it's a little bit funny. But on the other hand, it's just a version of that anybody would do. Because it's like the Wizard of Oz. You know, in the Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy and the gang, they're standing in front of the big booming voice with the fire and the smoke, and the voice is booming at them and saying to them, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. And then the dog pulls the curtain aside, right? And you see this kind of vulnerable, doddering old guy. That's in everybody. This vulnerable part of ourselves that does not want to be seen, that is really scared, and so creates this wizard. And in my case, and I think most people's cases, at least to some degree, they buy their own wizard. They buy that. And they can't see so easily. They've disowned, is another way to put it, their attachment needs and their attachment insecurities. And they might even have a point in their quote-unquote pseudo-assessments on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're really, or I should just say I, am missing the point. And that is, there's a part of me that needs something. So when I'm all focused on Colleen and what is she doing or what is she not doing that's correct or not correct or whatever, right? The question can be, what's going on behind my curtain? There's something there, and often I'm blind to it. I'm a pretty smart guy. I've been a client for longer than I've been a therapist, and I've been a therapist for 30 years. And I miss it because we're just kind of set up to miss it. That's just part of how it is. Makes me kind of sad.
Well, yeah. When we're hurt, when we're scared, which is frequent,
Yeah.
we have to do something to soothe ourselves. And one of the things available to us is to fall back, at least for us therapists, on our intellectual conceptualization ability, because it protects us from what we're terrified in the moment of,
Right.
which is, fuck, is this my fault? Did I do this? Or am I not lovable and I'm screwing this up? There's a reason why one is terrified and why one would grasp for anything to save you from that, even if that means sacrificing the relationship lamb on the altar in the process.
Nicely put.
And so it gets you through the dark times, and then eventually, with your therapist providing a corrective experience, you hear it and you're like, oh wait, I think I'm doing that thing again.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's what I never understand what people are saying when they say, how do you not overanalyze? People will often, whenever they ask this question of us, they're like, what's it like to be a therapist, and how do you avoid overanalyzing things? And so I'm always like, well, what is that? I don't think I know what that means. What's the definition of overanalyzing? And I think that's what maybe they're referring to, which is this using your professional clout and lingo to attack people in a narcissistic manner, to say, well, I know more about this and you are wrong and I have figured you out and I don't have any problems. And if any therapist ever did that, even with a client, they are not being a good therapist. So to be a good therapist is to first, rule zero, recognize your own issues and how it's affecting your countertransference, which really enhances marriage. I'm here to tell you that the constant practice and conversations that Bob and I have and other colleagues that I work with around what are my issues, how do they come up, what are my defense mechanisms, what's my attachment style, what are my reactivities, in what way am I undifferentiated, what was my part in that? I mean, the first question, or one of the first questions I ask all of my supervisees when they're presenting a case that they're struggling with is, well, what's the you in this problem?
Nice.
How are you involved in this issue? And it's a practice. It's not something that you just achieve. Like, I have now figured out countertransference. It's a thing that you do. It's a behavior that you enact. It's a process you walk through every time. And to overanalyze in the way that I think people think might happen is actually completely counter to what a therapist is supposed to do. Our version of quote unquote analyzing is to take responsibility and to apologize well before we would have otherwise if we weren't trained as therapists, to recognize our part and to own our feelings, know our feelings, and to not put upon other people Are we capable of being dicks to our spouses? Yeah, but that's when we're not analyzing. That's when we're being defensive in a way that is not the sort of optimal or what we strive to be as a therapist, you know. But I wonder if like a lot of psychology 201 students are walking around, quote unquote, and overanalyzing their friends, you know. And then a lot of people are walking around going, "Oh God, what's a therapist like?" I mean, if Psych 201 is creating this behavior, like what's Psych 701 going to do to people
right.
when it really goes the other direction? And I will tell you from me, I don't think you were like this, Bob, but I was absolutely like this before. When, you know, for the time I decided to become a therapist, it was early 1995, and I was 24 years old, and basically just a college student at, you know, just right out of my bachelor's. And before actually entering graduate school, I was already identifying with the professional identity of being a therapist. And there's this video, and I've talked about this in the podcast before, where I am totally overanalyzing all my friends on video. It's a long video it's like an hour and a half. We were having a party at our house over the summer, and it was kind of winding down. The party was, and you know, Glover and Broadhead and those guys, they were all sitting around, and Lisa and all these other people file, and I'm sitting across the room. They're sitting on the ground in my bedroom, and I'm sitting on my chair, and I'm basically like analyzing all of them. It's horrible. I mean, it is a horrible video, and I've transferred the VHS to my computer. And when I want to humble myself, I just watch that. Right. I'm just like, Jesus Christ, Honda, like tone down the narcissism, for crying out loud. But that's what I thought being a therapist was. But after I went to graduate school, I transformed. I had a massive amount of paradigm shifts, and one of them was this. And so understand, people out there, that good therapists, do the opposite of quote unquote overanalyzing. But to get at your question, Patron Belina, is, you know, you said, does it come up a lot? Is it a barrier to new relationships? How do you keep from therapizing your spouses and your friends? Overanalyzing, how does it affect the way you handle conflicts? So I'll tell you, similar to Bob, it doesn't come up that much anymore in terms of people reacting to me as a therapist. Well, one of the things is, like, I don't meet new people that much anymore. or if I do, they're well aware of the fact that I'm a therapist. So so there's that. But I think in Seattle, it's kind of commonplace to be a therapist. It's not it's not unusual. Like I bet you most people in Seattle have at least one friend that's a therapist. So I think it's not exotic. It doesn't scare people. It's like having a friend that's a lawyer or something. It's not strange. You know, in other areas of the country, it wouldn't be unusual if you had at least some of your friends who had like machine guns, you know. In Seattle, it would be very unusual if you had a friend who had like a cabinet full of automatic rifles, you know, or a grenade or something. Whereas in certain communities, there's probably a lot of people who have that kind of thing. And so we're very much acclimated. And sometimes when I step outside of Seattle and I mention the fact that I'm a therapist, I will get a reaction. There's a number of things I notice when I'm like, oh, I'm not in Seattle anymore. One thing is the fact that I'm a therapist will be exoticized. Another thing is the fact that I'm Asian will be exoticized, or the fact that I'm half Asian will be extremely exoticized. The other thing that I will get is my name. So in Seattle, when I say my name's Kirk Honda, I don't get a reaction. But as soon as I step outside Seattle or the West Coast, like outside of LA, San Francisco, basically out of Asian American, you know, centers, then I get comments. Oh, Honda. Hey, do you own a Honda? You know, like all those jokes. It's just like...
Funny, I don't even hear that in your name anymore. It's just like... Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I ran into this recently. A friend of mine, an old friend of mine, I was watching Russian Doll with Natasha Leggero. Do you know her? That actress?
Oh, yeah. That was a good show.
Yeah. And as I'm watching it, she was reminding me of this friend of mine, Sarah, this Canadian friend of mine. And I couldn't stop thinking about her because she looks like her. She has that kind of big shock of red hair. Mm-hmm. She's kind of short and kind of scrappy. And back in the day, she would drink and smoke a lot. And she just had that kind of real rough attitude about things. And I just couldn't stop thinking about her. And after I watched it, I emailed her and I was just like, I was watching this show and it just completely reminded me of you. And she's like, please tell me it's not Natasha Leggero. Or I don't know if I have her name right, but you know what I mean? I think that's the name. And she says, please tell me it's not her. And I was like, oh crap. Well, of course, because she looks kind of like her, Yeah. And of course, since Natasha Leggero has been famous, which has been a long time, probably like 20 years, she's been probably constantly getting that reference, right? And now her old friend calls her up as if it's a brand new revelation, And I didn't even have the heart to tell her. I was like, oh, never mind. Don't. I won't tell you who you were reminding me of. But anyway, so it doesn't come up that much anymore in Seattle, but in the past, for sure, it definitely would come up. In fact, when I was first training to become a therapist, I was, really interested in my studies in graduate school, and I would ask my friends about, things, because I was thinking about these things, and so my friends around me, I would sort of ask them similar questions, like, how does your brain work? Do you think this way? Because I'm studying this new thing, and I was just so excited, and a lot of my friends were just would sort of play along, but one of my friends actually got really angry at me one time. Mm-hmm. And I think he saw the writing on the wall, which is like, oh crap, Kirk's going to become a therapist. He's going to start asking me lots of questions about this sort of stuff. And I don't want to answer those questions. And so he got really hostile with me. I'll never forget it. It was verbally abusive. He basically just, shut the fuck up. I don't want to hear it, And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Like, okay. And because it was like an assignment that was really mundane. It was like not a vulnerable sort of question that one would ask. And you realize like, oh man, some people really are defended about this sort of stuff, which is fine to have, but not predicted. And so some people, the sheer fact that you're a therapist really, really threatens their defenses and causes them to be hostile in a way that they don't need to be, I guess. Have you ever experienced that?
That kind of defensiveness, no, I haven't. Though I can say that in my own way, I've been obnoxious. I'm not saying you were obnoxious. You were just doing a thing for class or whatever. But I think that I think it's sort of like normal development that to whatever degree everybody becomes a sophomore. Sophomore is a great word. It comes from Greek, the word for wise and the word for fool. So a sophomore is a wise fool. It's like a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? And in my own way, I've been obnoxious. And one of the things that I've discovered is, with regard to the quote-unquote pseudo-assessment, is if I'm not soft, if I'm not compassionate, then I'm definitely in my own kind of trip and doing that pseudo-therapy thing. And this can happen even with clients. So it's not a bad thing that have happened. What's important about it is pretty much what you were saying, which is that's an opportunity to manage your own countertransference and to ask what part of me is in this situation, right? Because I really want to kind of, that will get in the way of doing good work with somebody or get in the way of my connections with my people. So, we call it countertransference, but that sort of thing gets kicked up in everybody. And for me, it's an opportunity That's like a fucking therapist word. Sorry about that, guys. Let me try that again. When I do that, I'm out of touch with something in me, and there's a possibility that I can be in touch. And I've been obnoxious that way. So in answer to that person's question, Belina's question, I failed.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think it's okay to have a sense of humor about that and to recognize that in any kind of endeavor where you get a little bit of knowledge, you have a vulnerability to being obnoxious. It doesn't really matter what it is. It could be race car driving, and you're still going to be a sophomore.
Right. Totally. And on the same, so I don't know, the other side of the coin is that it absolutely does help me, and I'm quite positive it helps you, Bob,
Yeah.
in our conflicts. Imagine if we hadn't become therapists, how proficient we would be in managing attachment, bid conflicts, but with our spouses or with anybody.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and so you say, like, how does it affect the way you handle conflict? Is one of your questions, Belina. Is it absolutely? I can't imagine how poor of a husband I would be by this point if I hadn't become a therapist. Becoming a client has helped, but I would guess 80% of my growth has been being a therapist and learning and then applying it to myself and then seeing myself in my clients or my students and then helping them and then vicariously helping myself.
Right.
Doing the podcast and thinking about and learning new things and thinking, oh, okay, well, I kind of do that with my wife. And it has helped so much. The whole notion that becoming a therapist makes you obnoxious is true, but I would suspect that the majority for me, and I'm assuming for you too, Bob, is that becoming a therapist has made us kinder, better listeners, better able to own our own feelings, better able to not trigger your spouse, better able to understand when your spouse is triggered. I'd like to think that my conflicts have become so much easier to handle now that I've reached a certain point as a therapist. So that's what I'll say about that one.
I completely agree.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say is that, you ask, how do you keep from therapizing your spouse and friends? And I think I've said this before. I don't want to stop therapizing my spouse and my friends because, again, why not?
People will talk about that in terms of, if you're therapizing, it means you're pathologizing.
Right.
And that's the opposite of what you actually do.
Or being condescending or patronizing someone. That's not what therapy is. Therapy isn't top down in that way or patronizing or condescending. It's being a good listener. It's being a good friend. It's being loving. It's being empathetic. It's being understanding. It's not fake. To be a good therapist is to be fucking real and authentic and in the room and a human being. And when I am kind of therapizing Bob, or I'm therapizing my wife, or I'm therapizing my parents, it is real, man. It's authentic. And there's a part of my brain that's like, okay, don't say this because that's bad to say in the situation. And I've learned that because I'm a therapist.
Right.
Or a little bit of my attention is spent on, okay, contain their emotions, be a good, helpful listener in this moment. Now, that could easily edge into being fake or being professionalized listener to your friend, which can be off-putting, which can feel to the person like, oh, you're just treating me like I'm a client, which is kind of condescending. It's also kind of distancing. It's like, okay, I'm distancing myself from you and I'm treating you like a client and not like a human being. It's also distancing to treat a client like a client in that way and not like a human being. So do I therapize how do I avoid therapizing my spouse? I don't, because I consider my therapy to be a very authentic, real, human, very core to my being thing. And when I do it well to my clients and I do it well to my friends and family, I consider it to be one of the highest forms of relationships.
That's nice.
So I don't avoid therapizing them is the thing. Now,
Great
I will
answer.
say in the beginning of my career, when I didn't really understand that, I would sometimes dip into that. I would, like I had a friend who suffered from alcoholism, and I would try to help her with that. And instead of just being a good friend, instead of just listening, instead of, I did what I thought I was supposed to do, which was to, be a coach for her to be sober or something, which is, we all know, according to Al-Anon, not your job as a friend.
Right.
And it didn't work, lo and behold. So I didn't understand what therapy is supposed to be, and I applied my misunderstanding of therapy to my friend, and lo and behold, it didn't work. So so in that instance, it would have been helpful if someone would say, stop therapizing your friends because you don't understand what therapy is yet.
Yeah.
Anyway.